The fog curled low around the crumbling gates of Redwood High School, as if the earth itself were trying to hide what had happened here. Helen Mercer stood before the rusted entrance, clutching her coat tighter against the October chill. Years had passed, and yet the ache in her chest throbbed with the same sharpness as the morning she learned her daughter. Sophie was gone. They called it the vanishing. One spring morning in 1998, an entire senior class, 27 students, walked into the school and were never seen again. No bodies, no ransom, no suspects, just silence. The building had been shut down and sealed months later. Now it loomed, like a decaying shrine, windows broken, roof sagging, vines snaking up its brick walls like scars. Some townspeople whispered it was cursed. Others just looked away when the topic came up. But Helen never stopped looking, not really. Each year she returned on the anniversary. A ritual, a wound reopening. She knelt by the front gate and placed a single sunflower, Sophie's favorite, tin to the cracked earth. "I still hear you, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I see you, in my dreams." The dreams had started again last week. Sophie, standing in a dark room, reaching out. Her mouth moved, but made no sound. A flicker of fear in her eyes, as if she knew something was watching. Then the light above would burst, and Helen would wake up screaming. She rose, brushing dirt from her knees, and made her way to the side of the building. A fallen section of fencing allowed her to slip through. The air inside smelled of mildew, soot, and rot. The faint smell of old smoke still lingered from a fire that had gutted part of the auditorium years ago. Helen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she walked the familiar halls. Lockers once painted bright red and gold now flaked like diseased skin. The silence was too perfect, like the building was holding its breath. She paused outside room 204, Sophie's homeroom. She remembered it so clearly, Sophie laughing with her best friend Lily. Her purple binder always covered in messy doodles. Her wrist adorned with the same silver watch Helen had given her for her 16th birthday. Sophie had been wearing that watch the day she disappeared. It was never found. Helen opened her bag and pulled out the 1998 class photo. She had looked at it hundreds of times over the years, trying to find anything, a shadow, a gesture, a face that didn't belong. But it was only this morning, while dressing for the visit, that something different caught her attention. She angled her flashlight over the photo again. 27 students, smiling, standing in 3 neat rows. In their middle row, third from the left, was a boy Helen didn't recognize. Tall, curly hair, slight smirk, and on his wrist was Sophie's watch. She would recognize the band anywhere, and engraving on the clasp. "Love, Mom." Her breath caught, her fingers trembled. She zoomed in with her phone camera, enlarging the image. Yes, the slim silver face. The twisted loop in the band Sophie had fidgeted with. This wasn't a copy. It was hers. But why was it on his wrist? She flipped the photo over. The name printed beneath that student. Eric Lorne, not a name she remembered. Sophie ever mentioning, and yet there he was. The room around her began to feel tighter, the air heavier. Helen backed out of the classroom, her thoughts spiraling. She had spent years accepting that Sophie was gone, likely dead. But now a thread had appeared. One tug, and everything could unravel. She made her way to the library, hoping to find old school records. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Its inside dust coated every surface. Books lay scattered, shelves half collapsed. But the glass cabinet in the corner still held archived yearbooks. She found 1997, then 1996. But 1998 was missing. Of course it was. As she turned to leave, her foot struck something. A box half buried beneath a collapsed bookshelf. She knelt, pulled it free, and flipped the lid open. Inside were several envelopes, yellowed with age. One had the school's seal stamped in red waxen, broken. Another had no return address, just a single word scrawled across the front in fading ink. Confessions. Helen's hand hovered. Something inside her screamed to leave, But curiosity, desperation, and motherly instinct drove her to open it. The envelope contained several letters, typed, unsigned, anonymous confessions, abuse, secret meetings, rituals, threats, all pointing to someone inside. The school, faculty member, maybe more than one. Each letter hinted at control, manipulation, fear. One line stood out, burned itself into her brain. He said if we told, we'd disappear like Kevin did. Kevin, she froze. Kevin Torres had gone missing a week before the class vanished. Had been written off as unrelated, just another runaway. But Sophie knew him, used to come by their house. Her breath hitched. Helen tucked the letters back into the envelope, heart pounding. As she stepped into the hallway, something caught her peripheral vision, a flicker of movement down the corridor. Her flashlight beam snapped toward it. Nothing, just the dim hallway, sagging ceiling tiles, peeling paint. But for the first time in years, Helen didn't feel alone in the building, and she wasn't sure that was a good thing. As she exited the school, the wind picked up, whipping her hair across. Her face, she didn't look back. Just clutched the photo tighter. The boy in the picture was wearing Sophie's watch. Sophie's watch. And someone needed to explain why. Helen sat across from the duty officer at the station, clutching the faded class photo like a lifeline. Fingers had smudged its edges. She pointed at the boy Eric Lornand, the unmistakable silver watch on his wrist. That belonged to my daughter, she said, voice hoarse. Sophie Mercer. She disappeared the day that picture was taken. Officer, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes, glanced at the photo without much interest. Ma'am, that was 27 years ago. A lot of watches look alike. No, she said, firmer now. Look closer. The clasp. There's an engraving, love, Mom. I had it custom made. That's not a coincidence. He sighed, shifting. In his seat, Mrs. Mercer. We've had dozens of leads over the years. This won't go anywhere. Len felt the old helplessness rise again. How many times had she walked into buildings like this, begged for someone to care? And every time, doors had quietly closed behind her. But this time, someone was listening. From across the room, a young woman in uniform watched the exchange intently. Officer Julia Vance, newly transferred from the city, leaned forward behind her desk. When Helen left, defeated and tight-lipped, Julia quietly followed her outside. Mrs. Mercer, Julia called. Helen turned, blinking in surprise. Can I see that photo? Helen hesitated, then handed it over. Julia examined it carefully, her expression sharpening. You're right, it's not just any watch. Helen's breath caught. Julia lowered her voice. I just started here, but I've read a little about the case. Your daughter's disappearance. ... It doesn't sit right with me. It never did. Helen whispered. Julia promised to follow up, though warned she'd need to do it quietly. A lot of people around here don't like old wounds reopened. That night, in the dim light of the records room, Julia pulled the cold case file marked Redwood High Disappearances, minus 1,998. The file was thinner than expected. Too thin. She flipped through. Pagus initial reports, statements, press releases. Then she noticed the gaps. Interview logs were missing. No witness statements from teachers, no psychological profiles. Just an abrupt end marked case suspended. She leaned back in her chair. Uneasy. Why would a case involving 27 missing teenagers be so... empty? Meanwhile, Helen wasn't done either. Driven by a hunch, she called Margaret Hill, whose daughter Lily had been Sophie's best friend. Margaret answered after several rings, her voice hesitant. I know this is strange, Helen said, but I need to ask about the night before they vanished. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Margaret spoke. I remember that night, she said quietly. Lily came home late. She was shaken. She told me something had happened at school. ... something bad. Helen gripped the phone. Tighter, what did she mean? She didn't say much, just that there were things going on. And she said, we're going to stop him. I didn't know what to make of it. But later, someone knocked on our door, a man I never saw. His face, he just said, tell your daughter to forget what she saw. or she'll disappear too." Helen went cold. "And then?" she asked. Margaret's voice cracked. "And then Lily went to school the next morning, just like always, and never came home." The attic groaned under Helen's weight as she climbed. The narrow stairs, flashlight in one hand, the past in the other. Dust particles danced in the beam like ghosts, suspended in the stillness. Cardboard boxes lined the space like silent sentinels of another life. Back when? Sophie's laughter filled this house instead of silence. She hadn't come up here in years. But something Margaret Hill said wouldn't let her rest. "We're going to stop him." Helen needed to know who he was. She rifled through old bins of photo albums, school crafts, birthday cards. Then her hand brushed across a worn leather cover. Sophie's journal. Her throat tightened. She hadn't even known. Sophie kept a diary. She opened it slowly. The handwriting, sharp, anxious, little rushed, was unmistakably her daughter's. "April 3rd, Mr. Lennox is getting weirder. He watches us like we're on stage even when class is over. Lily says he tried to get her to stay after hours. I told her not to. Hope she listened." Helen's heart pounded as she turned the pages. "April 10th, we made a pact. Me, Kevin, Lily, Sarah, and Eric. No more pretending. If anything happens to one of us, the others speak up, even if we're scared." "April 14th. I think Mr. Lennox knows," smiled at me today in a way that made my skin crawl. "He said I had main character energy, like I'm part of a show. But I'm not acting." Helen stopped. "Eric. The same boy wearing her daughter's watch in the class photo. So he was part of the group. Kevin Heed disappeared a week before the rest of the class." She flipped further. The entries grew more frantic. Scratches. In the ink, words circled and underlined. "Something happened in the basement. Kevin found it. He said it's where Lennox takes them. But we weren't supposed to see it." Helen's hands trembled. She turned the final page only to find it ripped in half. But something had been tucked between the back cover and binding a folded, brittle sheet of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a map of floor plan of the school, scribbled in red. Ink was an arrow pointing to a location beneath the auditorium labeled Trap Door, and the words Stage Room, Keep Out. Helen's mind reeled. She set the diary down, grabbed the flashlight, and moved to the next box. Inside it was Sophie's copy of the 1998 Redwood High yearbook. Helen hadn't looked at it in decades. She wiped off the dust and opened it to the senior class page. Then she froze. Several students' portraits were crossed out in red ink, slashes right through their eyes. Not just a few, but 11 of them. All names she barely remembered now, but enough to see a pattern. All part of Sophie's circle of friends. Some were smiling, some looked uneasy, but all were gone. And below them, written in faint pencil, was a note. Those who stayed silent. She flipped to the faculty page. Mr. Lennox's photo stared back, young, handsome, confident, drama teacher, head of the theater department. He wore a perfect grin, but even in a still photo, Helen could sense the arrogance bleeding through. She slammed the yearbook shut, her breath shallow. It had all been here. All these years hidden in her own attic, a pact, a predator, trapdoor under the school, a hidden room. She returned downstairs, heart pounding with a mixture of grief and rage. The house seemed unfamiliar now, like it had been part of the lie. Like it had protected secrets she wasn't ready to see before. Her phone buzzed. "Julia Vance. I found something," the officer said without preamble. "Eric Lornhigh never graduated. His records just stop. No college enrollment, no employment history."
What?
It's like he disappeared too, but he's never listed among. The missing Helen blinked, but he was in the photo. "Wearing Sophie's watch, I know," Julia said, "and there's more. Kevin Torres, the boy who vanished a week earlier. His report was officially ruled a runaway." The coroner's office flagged a Jane Doe body in 1998 with clothes that matched Kevin's last known outfit. It was labeled unidentified male and quietly buried in a county grave. No follow-up. Helen's stomach turned. They knew. They buried him and walked away. There was a pause on the line. "Something's wrong in this town, Mrs. Mercer," Julia said softly. "I think it's always been wrong. And someone made sure it stayed that way." Helen looked again at the map, at the diary entries, at the slashed yearbook faces. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie writing all this in secret, hoping someone might one day read it and understand. They were trying to stop him, Helen murmured. They tried, and someone silenced them. She stared at the marked location under the auditorium. What if they never left? She whispered. Julia said nothing for a moment, then, I can meet you there tonight. No. Helen's voice was steady now. I have to go alone first. She's my daughter. I need to see it with my own eyes. Outside, the wind howled against the windows like a voice returning from the past, and Helen finally had a direction, a map. A truth buried in ink and dust. She was going back to Redwood High. But this time, she wasn't just grieving. She was hunting. The clouds hung low over Redwood High, heavy with the threat of rain. Helen stood in the tree line, her breath misting in the cold evening air, watching the school like a hunted animal studying its cage, the same rusted fence, same broken windows. But tonight, she wasn't just mourning, she was trespassing. Julia. Vance appeared a few minutes later, flashlight tucked into her belt and a slim crowbar in her gloved hand. She gave Helen a nod. No words. Just grim, shared understanding. Together, they moved along the building's east wall to the old auditorium entrance. Julia popped the corroded lock like she'd done it before. They slipped inside, and the door closed behind them with a dull groan. The smell hit instantly mildew, mold, and something metallic like blood and rust. Helen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as they stepped onto the stage. The red velvet curtain was moth-eaten and hung like torn flesh. The floor creaked beneath their feet, every step echoing in the dead silence. We're looking for a trapdoor, Helen whispered, unfolding Sophie's map again. Right side of the stage. Julia scanned the floor. There, the panel. The floor, different wood, just barely visible. Julia wedged the crowbar into the seam and pushed. The hatch popped open with a loud crack. A dark shaft yawned beneath them. The air that rose up was colder, older. Helen swallowed hard. They descended carefully, one after the other, into a narrow concrete stairwell that spiraled downwards. At the bottom, the passage opened into a long hallway. The floor was linoleum, black and white checkered, warped with water damage. Faint red paint still clung to the walls in peeling strips, once vibrant, now decaying. This part of the building was never on the blueprints, Julia murmured. Helen nodded. Because they didn't want anyone to find it. At the end of the hallway stood a metal door with a small, clouded window. Julia pushed it open. The room inside was large and utterly silent. Helen felt it instantly in oppressive stillness. That swallowed even the sound of breathing. The walls were lined with thick, black soundproofing foam. No echo, no outside noise. A stage set stood in the center, makeshift, rotting, painted cardboard backdrops, theater lights dangling from the ceiling by frayed wires. Mock audience of broken chairs faced the stage. It was like someone had recreated the drama classroom underground. Helen's eyes swept across the space. In the corner, several storage trunks sat stacked. Julia opened the first one. Costumes, uniforms, makeup kits. The second trunk held props, a fake knife, ropes, a typewriter. The third made Julia recoil. Inside were dozens of Polaroids, rubber banded into neat bundles. Helen pulled one free. Sophie, her head tilted forward, eyes half-closed expression, dazed. She looked drugged. Behind her stood Eric Lorne, holding her up, also looking disconnected. Other photos showed more students, all with the same vacant stares. Then she found it. A photo of the entire class standing on the small stage, but in front of them, wearing a white mask and black robe, stood a man, his face entirely concealed. Hands outstretched like he was conducting a performance. There was something ritualistic about it, something cold. Helen's hands trembled as she flipped photo after photo. More of Sophie, one with her tied to a chair, another with her and Lily. Holding hands, tears running down their cheeks. This wasn't theater, Julia whispered. This was something else. Helen could barely breathe. He made them rehearse. like it was a show. Julia began gathering the photos into evidence bags from her backpack. We have enough to reopen the case. Helen wasn't listening. Her gaze had fallen on a crude message scrawled across the back wall in thick red paint. We disappear too. Be remembered. She stepped closer, something shifting underfoot. She knelt and pulled up a corner of the linoleum. Beneath it, gouged into the concrete, was a list of names. Sophie, Lily, Kevin, Eric, Sarah, dozens more. The floor like a final cry. Julia's phone buzzed suddenly. She looked down. No signal. Of course not, Helen murmured. This room's buried under concrete and steel. It was meant to trap sound and people. A sudden noise made them both freeze. A snap like a twig. It came from upstairs. Julia quickly turned off her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. They waited. Another sound. Footsteps above them. Slow, deliberate. Pacing across the stage they had just stood on, Julia leaned in. Someone's here. She drew her weapon. Helen's heart raced, blood pounding in her ears. She clutched Sophie's photo and the bundle of Polaroids like they were sacred. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence returned, but now it pulsed with presence. Whoever it was, they knew someone was down there. Julia motioned for Helen to follow. Crept back through the hallway, up the spiral stairs, and carefully peeked through the open trapdoor. The stage was empty, but something had been left behind, in the center of the floor. A single Polaroid lay face up. Helen picked it up, her hands shaking. It was a photo of her and Julia, taken just minutes ago from inside the basement. Someone had been down there watching, recording. The Polaroid still trembled in Helen's hand as she sat in Julia's car, headlights off, engine idling on a side road just outside town. She stared at the grainy image, her and Julia, underground, frozen. Mid-step, the photo had been freshly taken. Someone had been down there with them, and whoever it was wanted them to know it. Julia stared straight ahead, jaw tight. This isn't just a cold case anymore. Someone's still protecting the past. Helen didn't respond. Her thoughts were a storm. Lennox, she finally whispered. It always comes back to him. Pete had returned home without incident, but the tension hadn't left their bones. Julia had stayed up digging through public records, yearbooks, and local archives until she found what they needed. Mr. Frederick Lennox died in a fire 2 years ago. Julia told her the next morning. His house caught fire in the middle of the night. The official report blames faulty wiring. But, Helen raised an eyebrow. But, his body was never fully identified. Only dental fragments. The fire department said the blaze burned hotter than expected, almost accelerant. But they ruled it an accident. Quickly, convenient, Helen murmured. And his wife? Still alive? Lives just outside town in the old Belridge estate. No phone number. Reclusive. Helen stood. Then we're paying her a visit. Belridge House was as unsettling as the history surrounding its tall iron gates. Long forgotten hedges clawing toward the sky, and windows like blind eyes staring out at nothing. The air smelled like forgotten time. Helen walked up the winding path, each footstep cracking on old gravel. Julia waited in the car. Helen had insisted. I need to go in alone. She'll talk to another woman, especially a mother. The front door creaked open before she could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, thin, gray-haired, wrapped in a faded silk shawl. Her eyes were sharp, despite the fine tremor in her hands. You're her, the woman said flatly. Helen blinked. Excuse me, you're Sophie's mother. I remember you from the papers. You were always loud. Helen hesitated, then nodded. You're Margaret Lennox. Margaret turned and walked back into the house without a word. Helen followed her into a sitting room that felt trapped in another century. Dusty velvet furniture, cracked porcelain, dolls and thick curtains that blocked out the sun. Why are you here? Margaret asked, settling into a high-backed chair, his fingers twitching on the armrest. I need to know what happened to my daughter. To all of them. Margaret stared at the fireplace, long cold. It wasn't his idea, you know. Frederick wasn't. The mastermind he was. Recruited. Helen sat forward. Recruited by who? Margaret smiled. A brittle thing. Do you know what real power is, Mrs. Mercer? It's silence. Controlled silence. Our school was a stage for something much older than drama. It was a proving ground. Helen felt a chill crawl up her neck. What was he doing to them? Margaret's eyes glazed over. They volunteered. They agreed to disappear, to be part of something greater. A performance meant only for those who understood. He was their guide. No child agrees to vanish, Helen snapped. Margaret looked at her then, eyes blazing. Don't be naive. They were gifted, broken, perfect for the stage. They wanted to be seen, truly seen, and he showed them how. You're insane. No, Margaret said quietly. I'm honest. More than most in this town. Helen rose, heart pounding. What happened to Sophie? Margaret tilted her head. She didn't belong. Not really. She resisted. And when the curtain fell, she chose the wrong side. Is she alive? Helen demanded. Margaret's expression twitched an almost smile, then flat stillness. That depends. Do you believe memory is a kind of life? Don't play with me. I don't need to, Margaret whispered. You're already in. The audience. Before Helen could press further, Margaret suddenly stood and walked to the door. Without warning, she slammed it shut, the lock clicking loudly behind her. Helen rushed forward, grabbing the knob. Open this door. But Margaret was already walking down the hall, her voice floating back. You came looking for answers. You won't like the ones you find? Helen slammed her palm against the wood. Let me out. A minute passed, then ta-da, then the door clicked. She flung it open and ran into the hallway, but Margaret was gone. The house was silent, empty. Julia met her on the porch seconds later, hand on her holstered weapon. I heard the door slam. What happened? Helen's face was pale. She knows everything. And she's not the only one. They rushed back to the car. As Julia drove, Helen clutched the Polaroids again. Her fingers stopped on the one with the masked figure. Julia, she whispered, what if Lennox didn't die in that fire? Glanced at her, troubled. You think it was faked? I think someone wanted the world to believe he was gone. But this, she held up the photo. This doesn't feel like a ghost. They drove in silence the rest of the way, a heavy question hanging between them. If the mastermind was still alive, then the performance wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The wind rattled the window panes as Helen sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the yellowed paper-ran old phone bill from 1998. Found tucked deep in a forgotten file box in her attic. The ink had faded, but there it was. A call. One missed call. July 3rd, 1998. 6:47 p.m. Sophie. She swallowed hard, stomach twisting. Had been just 43 minutes before the official time of the student's disappearance. She had no memory of the call, no voicemail, nothing. She had been in the kitchen that evening. She remembered that much arguing with her boss over holiday shifts. The phone had rung, and she'd silenced it, brushed it off now, 27 years later. That silence echoed louder than any scream. Julia, Helen said over the phone, I need you to come over now. Julia arrived in under 10 minutes, still in uniform, the scent of old paper and dust still clinging to Helen's living room. Helen handed her the phone bill. She tried to call me. I didn't answer. I never knew she even left a message. Did you have voicemail back then? Yes, but the recording wasn't there. When I checked, I always assumed it was a hang-up. Julia took the bill and scanned it, eyes narrowing. Your carrier Summital. They went under in the early 2000s, but if the call went through and there was a recording, there's a chance it was backed up to a central archive. Len looked up, hope flickering in her chest. You think it still exists? Maybe. Depends. If their data was ever sold or acquired? Julia tapped quickly into her laptop, fingers flying across the keys. Looks like Summital's data archives were transferred to a holding company, Repath Technologies, during bankruptcy. They digitized everything, including voicemails. Helen's breath caught. Can you get it? Julia didn't answer. Immediately, instead, she opened a secure browser window and began navigating through proxy networks and encrypted archives. Minutes passed, tense and thick. "I'm into the repository," she said finally. "Give me the number from your bill." Helen read it aloud. Julia entered it. The screen flickered, loading slowly, then -1 message found. Timestamp: July 3rd, 1998. 6:47 p.m. Status: archived. 1. Clicked play, a hiss of static, then a voice, Sophie's voice. "Mom." Helen felt her heart split open. "Mom, I know you're busy, but something's wrong." He found out. He knows about the map, about the photos, about the basement. The girl's voice shook with barely contained panic. "They're taking us tonight. We thought it was just a game, but it's not. It's real. It's happening. Please, please, forgive me for everything. I love you." A crash in the background. A muffled male voice shouting, then a whisper barely audible. "We have to run." The line cut. Helen stared at the screen, frozen. "Replay it," she whispered. Julia obeyed. Helen listened again and again. Each word carved a deeper wound, but also lit a fire. "She tried to warn me," she said. She knew what was happening. Julia sat back, face pale. "This confirms it. They were coerced or worse." Helen's mind raced. She mentioned the map, the basement. She knew it was more than a school game. "Which means," Julia said slowly, "someone else knew she'd found out. Someone who made that call disappear from your account." Helen stood. "I want that voicemail copied. I want it stored everywhere. USB, cloud, backup hard drives. This can't be lost again." "Already on it," Julia said, connecting a drive. Helen turned toward the window, watching the clouds darken over the horizon. If she knew about the photos, the map, then she might have left more behind, something she couldn't say over the phone. Julia looked up. "You think there's more in the diary?" Helen shook her head. If she knew she was being watched, she wouldn't risk writing anything, but maybe she hid something. Her eyes darted to the hallway. The attic. The attic was dim, the single bulb flickering overhead. Helen moved aside old boxes of clothes, Christmas lights, faded toys. Then she saw a small wooden trunk. Tucked behind an old mannequin, the name Sophie scratched into the side. She opened. It slowly inside were scattered keepsakes, a friendship bracelet, a theater program, a folded letter from a boy named Thomas, and a battered music box. But taped beneath the lid, hidden from plain view, was a small plastic cassette tape. Helen's hands trembled as she pulled it free. A label in Sophie's handwriting, "For if I disappear." They listened to the tape that night. Sophie's voice returned quieter, more composed than in the voicemail. "I know I sound crazy, but something's going on at school. Mr. Lennox isn't just a teacher. He recruits, he watches. Not just may all of us. He calls it the stage. He says we're part of a play no one else will ever see. He says we're chosen." She paused. "We thought it was just weird theater talk." But then students started changing, getting quiet, detached. Some even asked to stay after school alone with him. "I saw him leading a group into the basement once. They didn't come back until morning. I heard screaming, laughing, chants." Another pause. "They say if you're chosen, you get to vanish. They say it's an honor. But I don't want that. I want out." The tape ended in silence. Helen closed her eyes. She knew everything. She tried to stop it. Julia nodded. Slowly. "This is evidence. Real hard evidence. And if Margaret Lennox knew, others did too. Maybe even the school board. They covered it up," Helen whispered. "All of it." Julia looked at her with grim determination. "Then we expose them." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows again. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not a school bell. A church bell. 3 slow chimes. Julia turned to Helen, eyes narrowing. "It's midnight." Helen stared at the tape in her hand, feeling Sophie's voice still echoing in her ears, and deep inside, she knew. The final act hadn't started yet, but the curtain was rising. The morning after hearing Sophie's hidden tape, Helen felt a strange heaviness in the air as, though the truth, long buried, had begun to shift beneath her feet. She stood at the kitchen counter, stirring coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink, while Julia paced the room with the tape in hand. The pact, Julia said. It wasn't just a name in Sophie's diary. It was real, something dangerous. Nodded, and someone betrayed them. That's why they disappeared. Julia had been up most of the night combing through records archives, school newspapers, local forums, and faint digital traces of old yearbooks. Names began to emerge. Thomas Greer, Leah Vasquez, Evan North students from the class of '98. Some of the same faces crossed out in Sophie's yearbook. All of them were part of the theater club, Julia said, and all of them vanished. The same night, but there were others, Helen whispered. The ones who didn't vanish. What happened to them? Julia tapped her notebook. That's what I want to find out. And I think Margaret Lennox knows more than she let on. Helen raised an eyebrow. You're going back there? I have to. The Lennox home is the last link to that man, and if those files Sophie mentioned existed, they might still be hidden there. The Lennox house stood like a rotting memory at the edge of town, peeling paint, gabled roof caved in places, the garden overtaken by weeds. Julia approached with cautious steps, her badge hidden beneath her coat. They knocked silent. She knocked again, harder. Margaret Lennox appeared at the door. She looked thinner, her eyes more hollow than before, as if something inside her was slowly fading. Back again? Margaret rasped. Didn't I tell you the play was over? Julia held her ground. I'm not here to argue. I just want the truth. For the kids. Margaret laughed softly, a brittle, hollow sound. They wanted the truth too. That's why they made the pact. Julia stepped forward. Sophie, Thomas, Leah, Evan. What happened to them? Margaret's hand trembled. As it gripped the doorframe, he promised them a future, a stage only they could perform on. But when they saw the script, they tried to tear it up. Julia's voice softened. Please, if you have anything, files, recordings, anything they could help expose what happened. Sophie's mother deserves to know. For a long moment, Margaret just stared. Then, without a word, she stepped aside. The interior of the house was dim and musty, every surface layered in dust and secrets. Margaret led Julia to the back parlor where a crumbling bookshelf leaned. Precariously, she reached behind a warped row of books and pulled out a rusted key. In the cellar, she whispered, the filing cabinet. Bottom drawer. He told me to burn them. I couldn't. Julia took the key and descended the creaking stairs. The air grew colder, damper, until she reached the basement. A single dangling bulb flickered on. There, tucked behind moldy boxes, was an old metal cabinet. She opened it. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each one labeled with a student's name: Sophie Reed, Leah Vasquez, Evan North, Thomas Greer. Others too. Julia opened Sophie's file. First, inside were pages of typed transcripts. Interviews, she read. Mr. Lennox said we were special, that the world couldn't understand our art. He said if we told anyone, they'd ruin the performance and we'd be the villains. Another page. He called it an audition, but it wasn't acting. He made us take pills. Told us it was part of the immersion. Another. We tried to tell the counselor, but the next day she was gone. They said she moved out of state. Just like that. And finally a chilling note scrawled in red ink. They must choose loyalty or silence. Hands shook. These were statements. Real testimonies from students who tried to speak up. But none of these files had ever reached the police. No investigations had followed. She gathered as many folders as she could carry and returned upstairs. Why didn't you turn them in? She asked Margaret. Margaret stared at the empty fireplace, because no one would have believed them. Lennox had friends, judges, donors, board members. He was charming, untouchable. Helen's words echoed in Julia's mind. They covered it up, all of it. But he's dead now, Julia said. You're free. Margaret gave a thin smile. Freedom doesn't come when the jailer dies, not when you were part of building the prison. She turned away, refusing to say more. Back at Helen's house, the two women laid the files across the dining table. Pages fanned out like scattered confessions. Helen's eyes filled with tears as she read Sophie's handwriting. She was terrified, she said, but she was fighting. She didn't just run. She stood her ground. Julia pointed to a page in Leah's folder. Here it mentions a meeting. June 29th, 1998. Sophie, Leah, and Thomas met with someone called R about going to the principal. But after that, everything stopped. R, Helen asked, could be a staff member or another student. Maybe the betrayer. Helen stared at the page. They were going to blow the whistle, but someone stopped them. Julia nodded grimly. We're not just dealing with a predator. We're dealing with a network. Lennox didn't work alone. Helen thought for a long moment. Then, voice tight, she said if some of the students backed out or were threatened into silence, maybe one of them is still around. Leah's eyes lit up. A survivor. Helen stood, already moving to the attic. I need the yearbook again. She returned with the 1998 edition, flipped through the pages. Stopping at a photo of a girl with short blonde hair face, not crossed out. Her name was Christabel, Helen said. She was Sophie's friend, always stayed on the sidelines. Julia checked the files. No folder for her. No mention at all. Helen whispered, maybe she was the one who ran. And suddenly, they knew. The next step wasn't in the past. It was in finding who made it out alive. It began with a phone call. The sheriff's office had discovered human remains in the dense pinewood forest bordering Redwood High. A hunter's dog had sniffed out something beneath a half-rotted tarp. Partially buried beneath moss and bramble, Julia arrived at the scene as dawn broke. Fog hung low, curling around tree trunks like wary ghosts. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind, the scene quiet, except for the rustle of leaves and the murmur of deputies. The forensic team was crouched over the shallow grave. What do we know? Julia asked, stepping carefully over the tape. Dr. Patel. The forensic pathologist looked up grimly. Teenage male, estimated time of death, 25 to 30 years ago.
Caused blunt force trauma to the skull. No ID, but...
She held up a plastic evidence bag. Inside, it was a delicate silver bracelet, tarnished but unmistakably engraved. Helen gasped behind Julia. That's Sophie's. The tiny inscription read, Breathe, Sophie, Mom. Julia's blood chilled. Where was this found? Patel nodded toward the remains, clutched in his hand. The boy had been buried without ceremony, without a marker, just dumped and hidden. But somehow in those final moments he'd held on to something of Sophie's. That detail, more than the exposed bones or dark soil, twisted Julia's stomach into knots. He was trying to protect her, Helen whispered. Or she gave it to him. They returned to the car in silence. The forest, still thick with unanswered questions. Back at the station, Julia dug into old missing persons files from 1998. After hours of scanning microfilm and digitized archives, names stood out. Kevin Torres, age 17, reported missing 1 week before the official disappearance of the senior class. No one ever linked his case to Sophie's, Julia said, flipping through the sparse report. He was labeled a runaway, said he had trouble at home. Helen leaned in, but Kevin was in the same drama class as Sophie. And if he disappeared just before the others, he may have known something or tried to stop it. What? Julia pulled a faded group photo from the file taken at the drama club's spring showcase. There was Sophie, bright-eyed and smiling. Kevin stood off to the side, half smirking. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder. They'd been close. I bet he found out what Lennox was doing, Julia said, voice low, and he paid for it. That evening they sat in Helen's living room, surrounded by a web of evidence files, photos, maps, and red thread lines that connected names like Sophie, Kevin, Thomas, Leah, and Evan. All of them gone, except one, Krista. Helen stared at the single unmarked face in the yearbook. If Kevin was killed trying to warn someone, Maybe it was her. Maybe she's the one who got away. Julia nodded. We need to find her. She started running her name through databases, but it wasn't easy. Krista had moved out of state shortly after graduation. No social media. No recent address. Then Helen remembered something. She always talked about wanting to be a nurse, said she wanted to help people after all the hurt. Julia tried a new angle nursing licenses, cross-referenced with age and maiden name. After 20 minutes, she found a match. Krista Belsaronson, licensed nurse, currently employed at a women's clinic in Portland. Helen's hands trembled. She's alive. And she might be the last one who knows the full story, Julia said. We need to get to her before someone else does. Meanwhile, the forensic lab sent over new results. Despite the body's age, they'd managed to extract DNA from the bones and confirmed the remains were indeed Kevin Torres. Dirt found in his mouth suggested he had been buried alive or at least still breathing when the grave was covered. Julia felt nauseous. She wasn't just trying to escape, she said aloud, staring at the report. They were hunted. Why? Helen clutched the bracelet in her hand. Why was this with him? Maybe Sophie gave it to him, Julia said. To protect him, or as a promise we'll meet again. But she never got the chance. Helen looked haunted. And now, he's finally been found. But the unspoken fear lingered between them. How many more graves waited, undiscovered in those woods? That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, yearbook open in front of her, the photo of the drama club circled in red ink. Her eyes kept drifting to Mr. Lennox's wide, charming smile. But now, behind it, she saw the truth. A predator wearing a mask of brilliance and warmth, and around him, kids, vulnerable, trusting, some still alive. Some now bones in the ground. She flipped the page and noticed something she hadn't before, a message scrawled in the margin of the yearbook. Never trust the director. He rewrites the ending. KT Kevin Torres had left a message. One last warning, hidden in plain sight. She ran to Julia's room and shoved the book at her. Look. Julia read it, eyes widening. He knew. He tried to stop it. This whole thing, it wasn't just grooming. It was a system. A cover-up. And he was the first to push back. Helen sat down hard. Krista might be the last thread we have left. Julia stared at the book. We leave for Portland tomorrow. But as they packed, a call came in from the sheriff's office. A local hiker had reported something disturbing. Another shallow grave, not far from where Kevin had been found. This one was fresher, unmarked, recently disturbed. Julia's stomach sank. Someone's cleaning up loose ends. Helen's voice trembled. Do you think they know we're getting close? Julia didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, staring into the dark line of trees behind Helen's house. No, she said. I think they've always been watching. Old VHS tape had been buried deep inside a cracked cardboard box, labeled Drama Spring. Showcased 1998. Dust blanketed it like a tomb. Helen found it in the sealed storage closet beneath Margaret Lennox's crumbling staircase. Julia pried open the rusted latch and carried the box out like sacred cargo. They barely spoke on the drive home. Now at midnight, the only light in Helen's living room came from the blue glow of the television screen. The VCR whirred and clicked. As the tape loaded, then static, and then a wide shot of the Redwood High Auditorium, the camera panned across a modest stage, dressed like a crumbling mansion. Torn curtains, mismatched furniture, the backdrop painted in grayscale, evoking an eerie sense of timelessness. Students stood motionless, in faded period costumes, 19th century garb stitched too tightly, faces powdered pale. The title card appeared, The Forgotten Ones, written and directed by Mr. Lennox. Julia exhaled slowly. Here we go. Performance began. Soft music played, warped piano notes, almost childlike. One by one, students delivered monologues. But there was something wrong. Their voices trembled unnaturally. Their eyes flicked toward the audience. Rather, toward Mr. Lennox, who was never shown but whose presence loomed just off screen. I dreamed I was invisible, a girl murmured. And when I screamed, no one looked. I traded my name for silence, said another. Now I'm only a whisper. Then Kevin appeared. Helen's breath caught. He wore a cracked porcelain mask. His lines were stilted, almost robotic. Said we'd be stars, he recited. But stars die too. Alone, cold, forgotten. Behind him, Sophie stood perfectly still. No lines, just her eyes wide, pleading. Brimming with something unsaid, the scene shifted. The play's second act unfolded in a mock classroom. The chalkboard. Behind them read, "Obedience equals opportunity." Sophie finally spoke. "We were told to pretend," she said. "But pretending feels like dying slowly." Helen leaned closer. "She's not acting. That's real fear." Julia froze the tape, rewound, played again, watching Sophie's hands. Her fingers tapped lightly against the desk. 3 slow taps. 2 fast, 1 slow. Morse code. "Julia," whispered, "she's signaling." Helen grabbed a notepad and scribbled the pattern. "It's not complete, but I think it's an S4 save." The camera jolted, suddenly moved by someone's hand and zoomed in on Sophie's face. Her lips were pressed tight. Her eyes glistened. Then she looked straight into the lens. Julia paused it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. She knew, Helen said softly. She knew this tape might be the only thing left. In the final act, the class assembled center stage. One by one, they lit candles. The dialogue turned cryptic. "We agreed," said Leah, "to disappear as one, to fade together." Kevin stepped forward. "We were never meant to be remembered. That was the pact," Sophie added quietly. "If they forget us, then maybe they'll stop watching." Helen's nails dug into her palm. "This isn't a play," she said. "It's a confession. A warning." The lights on stage dimmed. Each student stepped forward, said one word, and walked off stage into darkness. Gone, taken. Empty, erased. When Sophie stepped forward, her voice cracked. "Forgive." Then she too vanished into shadow. The stage went black, silence. Then dash an odd sound. Not part of the performance. A shuffle, like the camera being moved. The screen turned slightly. It's just enough to catch a reflection on the stage's back wall. A figure stood there, masked, watching, not part of the play. The screen went to static. Julia ejected the tape, her hands trembling. That was never meant to be seen by the public. Helen stared at the blank screen. And yet it was recorded, on purpose, to document, or to threaten. Julia stood. "We need to get this digitized. This is proof. Someone orchestrated this." Lennox was the face, but he wasn't alone. Helen remembered Margaret's words. They agreed to disappear, but someone betrayed them. She looked again at the stage photo in the yearbook. 17 students had performed that night. 17 stepped off stage. Only Krista hadn't vanished. Maybe because she never agreed. Maybe because she ran. The next morning, Julia sent the VHS to a secured digital lab and made 3 copies of the footage. One for her, one for the sheriff. One to be held off-site, but her gut said someone already knew that night. She found her apartment door ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing obvious disturbed, but her files on Lennox, opened, rearranged slightly. Someone had been there. She called Helen immediately. "They're watching us now." Helen checked her windows. Her skin crawled. "What do we do?" "We go to Krista. Tonight. No more delays." The drive to Portland was quiet. The tape haunted them both. "They made it seem like art," Helen said. "Into performance, but it wasn't a play. It was a funeral." "They wanted someone to find it," Julia replied, "and now we have." They arrived at the women's clinic just before closing. A nurse with graying blonde hair and tired eyes looked up as they entered. "Christabel Sorensen?" Julia asked. The woman's face paled. Helen stepped forward. "We know about the pact, about the tape, about Sophie." Krista closed her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Not here."
Ow.
She led them to a break room and locked the door behind them. "You weren't supposed to find it," Krista said softly. "That tape, ... We buried it with everything else." Helen's voice trembled. "But Sophie wanted us to." She looked into the camera. She knew. Krista sat down heavily. "He told us if we exposed him, the school would fall. Our families would suffer. Some believed him, others didn't. Kevin tried to go to the police. Julia leaned in, and they killed him." Krista nodded. "They made it look like he ran, and they came for the rest of us, one by one. Some were taken. Some took their own way out." "But not you," Helen said. "I ran," Krista said.
"I changed my name.
"Cut ties. I live small, quiet. Because if I don't," she looked at the door, her eyes wide, "they'll come again." The Redwood Town Square had never held so. Many people in silence. A makeshift memorial sprawled beneath the bronze statue of the founding mayor, now draped in candles, photographs, and fading yearbook pages. The names of the 17 missing students had been printed on a long banner that rippled in the summer breeze. Helen stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching Sophie's photo to her chest. Today wasn't supposed to be hers. The mayor had organized the service as a community day of remembrance. A brief, sanitized version of history would be offered. Poems, a prayer, a band playing too cheerfully. All for closure. But Helen didn't want closure. She wanted truth. The microphone sat unattended on the small stage, waiting for the next speaker. A priest in crisp robes finished his blessing and turned to leave. The mayor began to step forward again. Helen climbed the steps first. Gasps fluttered through the audience. Julia watched from the edge, her phone recording. She gave Helen a small nod. Helen adjusted the microphone with both hands. Her voice trembled at first. "My name is Helen Granger, the mother of Sophie Granger, one of the 17 students who disappeared from Redwood High School 27 years ago." A hushed stillness fell. "I've stayed silent for too long," she continued. "I believed the stories you told us, that they ran away, that they were troubled, that nothing more could be done. But I was wrong." Helen pulled a folder from her bag. "I've seen the hidden basement beneath the school, the one you never told the public about. I've read the sealed files taken from the Lennox home, interviews with students who were threatened, silenced, and betrayed." Gasps turned to murmurs. She held up a black and white photo, Kevin Torres, standing in a school hallway. "This is Kevin. He disappeared 1 week before the others. His body was just discovered in the woods." She pointed to the banner behind. His name isn't even listed." Whispers turned to voices. Julia kept recording. Her heart pounded. "They were groomed," Helen said, her voice rising, "manipulated. And when they tried to expose the truth, someone silenced them. Not with justice, but with fear and shame." The mayor stepped forward, but Helen didn't stop. "You told us to move on, that our grief would fade. But it didn't. It grew. Because the people we trusted, this town, this school, buried the truth alongside our children." She opened a worn envelope and held up the VHS tape. "This is a recording of the final school play. It's not a performance. It's a cry for help. It shows what they endured." The sheriff stood at the edge of the stage, looking pale. Julia stepped forward now, voice firm. "I'm Julia Kerrigan, an independent investigator. I've already sent copies of this evidence to major news outlets. By this evening, it will be national." A ripple of alarm swept through the crowd. Emails, forensic reports. The tape, everything. A woman in the front row, loudly, tearful, stood up. "My son was in that class," she said. "They told me he ran away to Los Angeles, but his wallet was still in his locker." Another parent rose, then another. "My daughter said she was scared of the theater teacher. I ignored her. It made us feel like it was our fault. I asked too. See the investigation file. They said it was sealed." One by one, voices filled the square. Helen stepped back from the mic. Her legs shook. Julia caught her. From a corner of the crowd, someone shouted, "Where is Mr. Lennox now?" The sheriff tried to speak, but the words faltered. Julia turned to the crowd. Mr. Lennox retired quietly, then vanished from public record 2 years ago. We believe he's being protected by who? Someone asked. Talon looked directly at the mayor. That's what we intend to find out. Within hours, the story exploded online. #Redwood17 trended nationwide. News vans arrived before sunset. Journalists lined up outside Helen's house. That night, Helen sat in her kitchen, watching herself on the news. The footage of her speech played on loop. Julia paced. Phone pressed to her ear. They're reopening the case, she said, hanging up. The district attorney is assigning a new team. FBI's been notified. Helen nodded numbly. Took them long enough. There was a knock at the door. A tall woman in a dark coat stood on the porch. She wore no badge, but her eyes were sharp. Special Agent Lorna Price, she said, showing her credentials. Mind if I come in? Helen exchanged a look with Julia, then stepped aside. Price sat across from them, flipping open a notebook. We've reviewed the footage and the sealed testimonies. What you found changes everything. Do you believe? Us, Helen asked. I believe something's been covered up for decades, Price said. And I believe it wasn't just one man. Julia leaned forward. I think there was a network. People who knew, maybe even benefited. Price nodded. We have reason to believe other staff at the school were aware. Possibly even individuals. In law enforcement, Helen's jaw tightened. They let it happen. Price looked at her carefully. Do you feel safe staying here? Helen hesitated. No, but I'm not running. The agent smiled faintly. Good. Then we'll protect you. She handed Julia a burner phone. This is encrypted. You call me directly with anything else you find. If anyone contacts you, claiming to help verify through me, Julia pocketed the phone. About Christabel. She's under protective watch now. Her testimony will be key. But there's one other name that keeps coming up. Helen sat up straighter.
Who?
He was vice principal at the time, quietly retired. I believe he coordinated file removals. I remember him, Helen whispered. Sophie said he always watched the rehearsals. Julia grabbed her notebook. Then that's our next step.
Late.
That night, Helen sat alone in Sophie's room. She hadn't touched it in years. The posters on the walls had faded, corners curled. A journal lay half open on the desk, lyrics, half-written poems. Dreams. Just she opened the music box on Sophie's dresser. The same melody played from that VHS tape. Helen closed her eyes. You were never meant to disappear, she whispered. We're meant to shine. Outside, the news vans buzzed. The world was finally listening. The knock came just past midnight. Helen jolted awake in her armchair. Soft hum of the television still playing the news report on Redwood's reopened investigation. Outside, the street was cloaked in fog and hush. It's a kind of silence that presses too long on the ears. 3 soft knocks again, and nothing. She opened the door slowly. A woman stood on the porch, thin, pale. Her hair hung damp around her face. Her clothes were torn at the hem, her shoes caked with mud. But it wasn't the clothes or the hollow eyes that made Helen's breath catch. It was the necklace. A silver locket engraved with a tiny moon and star. Sophie's. Helen staggered forward. Sophie. She whispered. The woman didn't speak. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her eyes, wide and brimming. Locked onto Helen's hand, a tremor moved through her like wind through brittle leaves. Helen reached out, hesitantly, like she was touching a ghost. Her fingers brushed Sophie's cheek. She was real. Helen dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter into her arms, sobbing as if years of pain were finally being excavated all at once. Sophie didn't cry. She barely moved. But she didn't let go. For the first 2 days, Sophie said nothing. The doctors ran tests. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and bruised, but not broken, not completely. Julia stayed at the house, pacing, writing, recording. Every new detail. Agent Price visited twice a day. We're not pushing her, she said. When she's ready. Helen stayed by her daughter's side, sleeping on a cot next to the bed. Sophie didn't flinch when touched, but her eyes rarely left the corners of the room, always scanning as if someone might appear in the shadows. On the third morning, Helen woke to find Sophie sitting upright, staring at her old music box. When Helen moved to sit beside her, Sophie finally whispered, "I didn't think you'd still be here." Helen froze. "I never stopped," she said. "I looked for you every single day." Sophie's voice cracked like dry leaves. "He said you forgot me." "Who?" Helen asked gently. Sophie looked down. "Mr. Lennox and the ones who took us after." That afternoon, Agent Price returned. Helen sat beside Sophie as Julia recorded, documenting every word carefully. "Respectfully, they moved us after the second week," Sophie said, voice hoarse. "We were blindfolded. I think it was a bus. We didn't know where we were going." "Many of you?" Price asked. 16. One died before the move."
Kevin?
Her eyes filled. "He tried to run. I heard the scream." Helen squeezed her hand. "They split us up. Pairs, sometimes alone. Houses, warehouses, basements. Always watched. Always filmed." "For blackmail?" Julia asked. Sophie nodded. "At first, they said it was punishment for what we'd done, that we were trying to ruin good men's lives. Later, it was about leverage, threats, power. Power for who?" Price asked. "One of the boys," Sophie said slowly. "His uncle was a senator. Another girl's father ran an oil company, I think. They made us confess on tape, say we lied, say we wanted it. Then they'd send the tapes to families, to lawyers, but they never let us go. Do you remember?" "Names?" Price asked gently. "Some, but there were others in masks. Men who never spoke." Helen leaned forward. "How did you get away?" Sophie looked at her hands. "A girl I was with. Jordan. She got secretly sick. I don't think they wanted a body to deal with. They dumped her outside a hospital. But they messed up. They left me with her unconscious. They thought I was too weak to move." "You escaped?" Julia asked. "I ran. 4 hours. Hid in a truck bed. I don't even know where I was. I just kept going. And when I saw the Redwood sign on the highway, I knew I was close." Helen was crying again, but this time it was relief, not fear. Agent Price stood. "We'll need to keep her under protection. And if we can find this girl, Jordan, we may have more testimony." Sophie looked up. "Some of the others are still alive." "I know it." Later that evening, Sophie opened the locket around her neck. Inside was a photo of Helen and herself, taken the summer before she disappeared. "I never let them take it," Sophie whispered. "No matter what they did." Helen hugged her tight. "You came back," she said softly. "You came back, and now we're going to bring them down." The next morning, the FBI announced a nationwide manhunt. Photos of the missing students, aged up with forensic software, were aired on every network. Julia's article went live. The title read, "Buried Voices: The Redwood Conspiracy and the Children Who Survived It." The story hit like a lightning strike. Politicians denied involvement. A retired judge was placed under investigation. A former Redwood police chief was subpoenaed. But Helen only cared about one thing now: who had betrayed them back then. Who had told Lennox about the plan? Who was still out there watching? That night, Sophie sat at the window, staring into the quiet street. Helen brought her tea. "They're going to come for us again," Sophie said quietly. "Let them try," Helen replied. "They're not hiding behind shadows anymore." Sophie looked at her mother. "I remember something. Symbol carved into a door at one of the houses." "What was it?" Helen asked. "A circle, the triangle inside, and a line through the middle." Helen's blood ran cold. She'd seen that symbol once on an old yearbook, stamped next to the drama club's page. Sophie added, "They called it the Curtain Society." Helen looked to Julia, was already typing. The curtain was rising, and the final act hadn't even begun. The headlines painted a picture of victory. Redwood, secrets exposed, arrests made in national abuse scandal. Survivor reunited, with family after years in captivity. But behind the headlines was a quieter truth, a slower, more painful reckoning. For Helen, Justice wasn't a verdict. It was the sound of Sophie screaming in her sleep. They came nearly every night. Dreams twisted into memories, memories into torment. She'd wake drenched in sweat, clawing at her sheets. Whispering names Helen didn't recognize, names of other students. Of guards, of places where her voice had been stolen. Helen tried. Everything soothing her with lullabies from childhood, leaving a nightlight on, playing soft music. But trauma doesn't keep to a bedtime. Sophie never returned to who she was. She rarely laughed. She struggled to eat in front of others. She flinched at sudden movements and locked the bathroom door 3 times before entering. The girl who once danced barefoot in the rain now walked carefully through every moment of life, as if waiting for the floor to vanish beneath her. The town of Redwood fractured like glass under pressure. Some rallied. They held vigils for the missing, placed candles on the school steps, painted murals with the faces of the students gone too long. Others turned away, unwilling to believe they'd lived beside monsters. "You should be proud," one neighbor told Helen as she passed. "You didn't stop? You brought her back." Helen nodded politely. But inside all she could think was, did I bring her back, or just pull her out of the fire too late? Julia resigned from the force 2 weeks after the federal task force took over. Her badge rested on her desk like a weight she'd finally let go of. "I believed in the system," she told Helen, clearing out the last of her files. "But it was built to protect the wrong people." "You did more than most," Helen said. "You gave Sophie back her story." Julia gave a hollow smile. But at what cost? She moved to Portland shortly after, hoping for a quieter life one without. Basements and secrets and files buried under floorboards. The National Tribunal hearings began in September. Helen didn't want to speak at first, but Sophie asked her to. "I don't want them to forget," she said quietly. "If you speak, they'll have to remember." The hearing was held in a marble-paneled chamber in Washington, cameras rolling, reporters whispering in the wings. Helen stood at the podium, hands trembling, a photo of Sophie in her coat pocket. "I am not a politician," she began. "I am not a lawyer. I am simply a mother." Her voice grew stronger. "My daughter was taken, not just by one man, but by a web of silence that wrapped this country like a shroud. She was hidden not in the shadows, but in plain sight. Every adult who turned their back made that possible." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We searched for justice," she said slowly. "But what we found was silence in power's shadow." For a moment no one spoke. Then someone clapped. Then another, till the chamber filled with the reluctant applause of those who finally saw what they hadn't wanted to. Outside, news cameras surrounded her. She answered none of the questions. She simply walked back to the car. Sophie waiting inside with dark glasses and a scarf wrapped tight around her neck. "I watched from the live stream," Sophie said quietly. "You sounded like the mother I always remembered." Helen reached for her hand. "You're the bravest person I know." Sophie didn't reply, but she squeezed her mother's fingers with fragile strength. Back in Redwood, the school sat surrounded by yellow tape. Redwood High had been closed indefinitely. Federal agents combed through old props, trapdoors, and student files in what used to be the drama department. The building had become a mausoleum of missed warnings. A crew removed the theater sign above the auditorium door. In its place, someone had spray-painted "The Final Act." A week later, the school board voted to demolish the structure. Some said it was to build anew. Others said it was to bury shame beneath concrete. Helen stood across the street with Sophie. Watching cranes move in, "They should have listened sooner," Sophie murmured. Helen nodded. "They didn't want to." "Do you think they'll forget again?" Sophie asked. Helen looked at the school one last time. "Not if I have anything to say about it."